I mean, I do think we're all tempted. That's probably why it's in there. I think we all do have struggles with this kind of thing, if I'm being honest. At least for some of us, it's more tempting than others. That's why it has to be a law. That's why the Christian life is discipline, I guess. It's not, I don't know, not the easiest thing to talk about, but maybe that's why it needs to be a commandment instead of just being common sense. I was thinking about what to say for this episode on the seventh commandment, what God says about forbidding adultery. And it's a funny topic because we think this should be so obvious, in our wedding vows, we promise never to be unfaithful to our spouse. I mean, it's ensconced in our legal system. It's all common sense and all of this cultural consensus that says that cheating is wrong, adultery is wrong. We don't hear a lot of serious voices that tell us, well, it's not that bad. Pretty much everybody who thinks about the situation seriously says adultery is wrong, and yet here we have to have a whole commandment about it to make sure that we're not going to do it. Is it that tempting? Is it that pleasing to us? It's a real question that we have to ask ourselves. And when I'm thinking about the law condemning adultery, I think about three things. The first thing I think about when I think about this commandment against adultery is some really, really good advice I got when Sarah and I were engaged. And this advice says, think about your relationship more like work than romance. And that sounds kind of sad. It sounds kind of, I don't know, unintuitive or unromantic. But the point is that romance is sort of this magical, spectacular thing that happens. And it's really neat to have it on a date. It's really neat to have it when conditions are right, to have romance between two people. But that's not the whole story in marriage. This good advice that I got says marriage is work. Your wedding will be romance, but your marriage, your everyday relationship, it's going to take a lot of work. We might have heard this advice before, but when God says, thou shalt not commit adultery, God is saying you are not going to neglect that hard work that it takes to stay married. You're not going to neglect the emotional work and the spiritual work that it takes to stay connected, to keep two people together in what is not only a legal relationship and not only a romantic relationship, but a spiritual relationship. The work is the thing that prevents against adultery. That's something that we have to hear again and again in our modern society. The second thing I think about when I think about this commandment about idolatry is over and over and over again in the Bible, God equates idolatry with adultery. In fact, the words in English even sound similar. In Isaiah 57, Isaiah is talking to the Israelite people, and he says, you've made your bed on this mountain where you sacrifice to these foreign gods, and that bed is like the bed that you would lie with a prostitute on. I mean, he's not mincing words. He's talking about the lustful and really seedy and greasy parts of human experience. And he says, when you cheat on God, it's like you're cheating on your husband or your wife. The command for God's people in Israel is to remain faithful to God. And the promise that God makes is, I will always be faithful to you. I always have. I've brought you out of Egypt. I've rescued you from all these tribes. I've given you your own land. And the Israelites, again and again and again, they go away from the true worship of the one true God, and They go to this worship of these gods that give them the things that they want in the moment. These gods that would give them good weather, good crops, victories in war, that make them feel good, that wouldn't tell them that they weren't allowed to work or do anything on the Sabbath, wouldn't forbid them from eating certain kinds of food, wouldn't forbid them from sexual promiscuity. They would be allowed to do whatever they wanted. It's something that is so ingrained into the human experience that we ought not to be too quick to dismiss it. And we all suffer sexual temptation. We all suffer the temptation to get away from God's harsher commandments, to get away from the parts of the Christian life that seem harder, that seem tougher, seem like doubt would creep in. And not just doubt, but the temptation to break the rules that we know God has given us. In the end, the law that says we have to treat others the way we'd want to be treated is so similar to this law that says you may not cheat on your spouse. These two laws, they become so closely intertwined that Isaiah and other prophets understand. The worship, the true worship of the one true God is the same as that spiritual communion that one has only with their spouse. It's an amazing testimony. I've been walking just a little ways from my house, and I started out through this little street with trees on either side, and after a couple of minutes I come across this little wooded area. It's no more than a couple of acres, and it's behind a couple of people's houses. I'll show you. It's just this nice little respite, it's no big deal. And the funny thing is that stepping out into these woods on some daily walk, it changes your perspective about something. That's the way that I think God's perspective works when we think about this in a deeper way. So the third thing that comes to mind about adultery is, first, God says marriage is work. Human relationships are work. Second, God says that adultery with human beings is like idolatry. It's like cheating on God, and that's, as we know, the first commandment, the first crime that we're permitted or not permitted to do. And this third point is that the Bible over and over and over again not only condemns adultery, but says, here's the path of forgiveness if you are unfaithful. In John chapter 8, Jesus famously finds this crowd of people that are ready to execute a woman because the law says if a woman is caught in adultery, she should be stoned to death. That's how serious this law is. And what does Jesus say? He doesn't say, You've done a good job, but you could probably stone her a little bit faster. You could probably do it a little bit more efficiently. Jesus changes everyone's perspective, like coming upon new terrain. Jesus says, I want you to know, I want you to feel in your heart that this woman has not done something that you haven't done also. Maybe every one of you have been faithful to your spouse. Maybe every single one of you has never cheated on your wife or cheated on your husband. But how many of you, like her, have been caught as a hypocrite? How many of you have come across some new terrain and said, I don't think I'm going to change my perspective? How many of you have forgotten to give the grace to others that you would have expected for yourself? They were so fast to condemn this woman. They weren't so fast to condemn the man with whom she was cheating. Jesus, no doubt, has this in mind and saying, what is it that she's done that he hasn't done? It takes two to tango. It takes two to commit the sin of adultery, and yet only this woman is going to be executed today. Jesus, over and over again, and even in this small passage, is going to change our perspective. And in the end, his final word is, if any of you can honestly say that you have never been unfaithful to God, unfaithful to your spouse, unfaithful to your neighbor, unfaithful to any of the obligations that you have to love completely and fully this world that God has created, if any of you can honestly say that, then go ahead, by all means, cast that first stone. The crowd disperses and walks away. And he goes to the adulteress and says, has anyone in this crowd condemned you? And she says, no, no one. And he says, then neither do I condemn you. Jesus, the only one who legitimately could have thrown that stone, says, this is not the path that God calls for us. In our relationships, when we're unfaithful, we can't forget that this is the most serious thing that we can do in a human relationship. If you're married, you commit adultery, this is an extremely serious offense. But nothing is beyond the forgiveness of God. Nothing is beyond the reconciling love of God. Not even something so unthinkable as adultery. God finds a way. God finds a way to restore us, to bring us to new life, to let His grace fall on us like fresh rain, to change the world that's around us.